In this episode, we focus on active defense as a practical set of techniques that make your environment easier to defend by increasing visibility and creating friction for adversaries. For beginners, the phrase active defense can sound like something aggressive or external, but in professional security operations, it is usually about actions inside your own environment that change the odds in your favor. The idea is simple. Attackers succeed when they can move quietly, blend into normal behavior, and operate at speed while defenders are confused or blind. Active defense works by making important activities more observable and by making risky actions harder to perform without leaving evidence. It does not require you to chase attackers outside your network or to do anything that resembles retaliation. Instead, it is a disciplined approach to designing monitoring, access, and operational patterns so that malicious behavior stands out and takes more effort. When active defense is applied well, it reduces dwell time, improves detection quality, and makes incident response smoother because you have better data and clearer signals. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Visibility is the first pillar, and it starts with understanding that you cannot detect what you cannot observe in a consistent way. Many environments have lots of data, but the data is uneven, scattered, or missing where it matters most, which creates blind spots attackers love. Active defense aims to close those blind spots by ensuring that critical systems, critical identities, and critical workflows produce reliable signals. That includes consistent recording of authentication activity, meaningful records of changes to privileges and configurations, and adequate observation of network communications between important areas. It also includes making sure that logs are retained long enough and centralized enough to support investigation, because visibility is not only about collecting data, but also about being able to use it when you need it. A beginner-friendly way to think about this is that visibility is like lighting in a building. If the lights are bright and consistent, unusual movement is easier to spot, but if hallways are dark and cameras are missing, you cannot tell what happened even after the fact. Active defense is the work of turning on the lights in the places that matter most. Adversary friction is the second pillar, and it means creating small obstacles that slow attackers down and force them to expose themselves. Attackers often rely on convenience, such as broad access, shared credentials, flat network paths, and weak separation between systems, because those conditions let them move fast. Friction is the opposite, because it narrows access and increases the effort required to perform high-risk actions. Friction can be as simple as requiring stronger verification for privileged access, limiting where sensitive accounts can log in from, or reducing unnecessary connections between systems so lateral movement becomes harder. The goal is not to make work impossible for legitimate users, because that would harm the business and lead to workarounds that create new vulnerabilities. The goal is to focus friction on the areas that attackers abuse most, such as privilege escalation, credential theft, and movement between critical assets. When friction is targeted, the organization stays productive while attackers lose speed and stealth. A common misconception is that adding friction always increases security, but active defense is more careful than that, because poorly designed friction can create more risk. If you make normal work too difficult, people will bypass controls, share credentials, or avoid reporting problems, which weakens security and reduces visibility. Active defense techniques should therefore be aligned with normal workflows, so that the secure path is also the easiest path. This often means designing privileged access so it is tightly controlled but still usable, and designing monitoring so it captures meaningful events without drowning teams in noise. For beginners, a useful mental rule is that good friction is predictable and limited in scope, while bad friction is random, broad, and inconsistent. Predictable friction is easier to accept and easier to support because people understand when and why it appears. When friction is well designed, it makes malicious behavior feel uncomfortable and risky while keeping legitimate behavior smooth and supported. One active defense technique that strongly increases both visibility and friction is tightening and clarifying privileged access. Privileged accounts are powerful because they can change systems, read sensitive data, and disable defenses, so attackers frequently target them. Increasing visibility means ensuring privileged actions are recorded in a way that allows timeline building and accountability, such as clear records of when privilege was used and what it affected. Increasing friction means reducing how often privilege is available and reducing how broadly it can be used, so that an attacker cannot easily turn a single foothold into full control. This can be done by limiting which accounts have elevated permissions, separating administrative accounts from daily use accounts, and narrowing where privileged accounts can authenticate. The key concept is that privilege should be rare, visible, and intentional, because that combination makes misuse easier to detect and harder to hide. When privilege use is both constrained and observable, an attacker's path becomes narrower and louder, which is exactly what active defense aims to achieve. Another technique is improving identity visibility around authentication patterns, because many modern incidents involve valid credentials being used in invalid ways. Active defense focuses on making authentication behavior easier to interpret by ensuring that key contextual details are captured and by reducing ambiguity in what normal access looks like. For example, if users can log in from anywhere at any time with many different methods, then unusual access patterns are harder to identify. If you can narrow normal patterns by defining expected access routes and strengthening verification for unusual cases, then suspicious access stands out more clearly. This is not about making every login a major event, but about making higher-risk access more controlled and more observable. It also includes paying attention to failed attempts, unusual sequences, and privilege changes, because those patterns often precede a successful compromise. When identity behavior becomes clearer, both hunting and alerting improve because the data supports stronger conclusions. That clarity reduces guesswork during investigations and makes response decisions more confident. Network shaping is another area where active defense can add meaningful friction while improving visibility. Attackers often rely on moving laterally, meaning they move from one system to another inside the environment, and they succeed fastest when the network is flat and permissive. By reducing unnecessary pathways and grouping systems by purpose and sensitivity, you make lateral movement less convenient and more detectable. Visibility improves because when systems that normally do not communicate suddenly do, the pattern stands out, and monitoring can focus on boundary crossings that are more meaningful than internal noise. Friction improves because the attacker has fewer direct routes and must either find alternate paths or perform riskier actions that leave more evidence. The goal is not to isolate everything from everything, because that can break operations, but to intentionally restrict high-risk pathways and make exceptions explicit. When network paths are more intentional, the environment becomes easier to reason about, and attacker movement becomes harder to hide. This is a classic example of how a structural change can make detection and response better without relying on a new tool. Active defense also includes hardening high-value assets in a way that increases detection surface rather than merely reducing attack surface. Attack surface reduction is important, but active defense emphasizes that some assets must be monitored more intensely because they are likely targets. These assets can include systems that manage identity, systems that store sensitive data, and systems that provide administrative control. Increasing visibility for these assets means ensuring they produce richer, higher quality signals, and that those signals are reviewed and correlated in meaningful ways. Increasing friction means limiting who can access them, limiting how they can be accessed, and requiring stronger verification for changes. For beginners, it helps to imagine these assets as high-security rooms inside a building. You do not just lock the door, you also add better lighting, stronger logging of entry, and more scrutiny when someone enters. This approach makes it more likely you will detect suspicious behavior early, and it makes attackers spend more time and take more risks to achieve their goals. When attackers must spend more time, defenders gain time, and time is one of the strongest advantages a defender can create. Deception is sometimes discussed in active defense, and at a fundamental level it means setting traps or signals that reveal malicious behavior because legitimate users should not interact with them. Beginners often imagine deception as complex. But the core idea can be simple. Create assets or pathways that look attractive to an attacker but have no legitimate purpose, and then treat interaction with them as a strong signal. The value of deception is that it can produce high-confidence detection because it reduces ambiguity. If a resource is designed so normal work should never touch it, then access to it is more suspicious than a generic anomaly. Deception also adds friction because an attacker who probes or interacts with deceptive elements reveals their presence earlier. The challenge is that deception must be designed carefully so it does not confuse legitimate users or create operational risk, and it must be monitored reliably or it provides no value. Even without deep deception systems, the concept teaches an important lesson. Create signals that are hard for attackers to avoid if they are actively exploring. When you increase the number of unavoidable signals, attackers have fewer stealthy options. Another active defense technique is making changes more visible and more controlled, because attackers often succeed by making small changes that blend into routine administration. If changes to configurations, permissions, or security settings are poorly tracked, an attacker can quietly reduce defenses or create persistent access. Active defense improves visibility by ensuring changes are recorded clearly and correlated to identities and times, and it improves friction by requiring more intentionality around high-risk changes. For beginners, the key idea is that not all changes are equal, and the highest-risk changes should be the most visible and the least easy to do casually. When change activity is easier to audit, investigations become faster because you can see what altered the environment and when. It also helps proactive detection because unusual change patterns can become hunting hypotheses and detection signals. This is one of the ways active defense creates a feedback loop where improved observability leads to better detection logic. Over time, the environment becomes less friendly to stealthy manipulation. Active defense also benefits from tuning how alerts and investigations are connected, because visibility without interpretation can still produce overwhelm. Increasing visibility can increase data volume, so you need to focus on signals that are meaningful and reduce noise where possible. That means thinking about what patterns truly indicate high risk, such as unusual privilege use, unusual access to sensitive data, or unusual boundary crossings between systems. It also means ensuring analysts have enough context to interpret signals, such as asset roles, ownership, and expected behavior. When context is missing, analysts may chase false leads, and that wastes time and reduces trust. Active defense tries to make signals not only available, but also interpretable, which is a subtle but critical distinction. For beginners, you can think of this as the difference between having many cameras and having cameras placed where they show the doors that matter. The goal is not maximum data, but maximum useful visibility. In closing, active defense techniques are about shaping your environment so malicious behavior becomes easier to see and harder to perform without exposure. By improving visibility through consistent, meaningful telemetry and by adding targeted adversary friction through controlled access and intentional pathways, you shift the balance of power toward defenders. The strongest active defense work focuses on high-value identities and assets, clarifies normal behavior so anomalies stand out, and reduces unnecessary complexity that attackers can hide within. It avoids the misconception that active defense is retaliation and instead emphasizes internal improvements that make operations more resilient. When active defense is tied to hunting and to continuous improvement, it becomes a loop where discoveries drive changes and changes produce clearer signals. That loop reduces guesswork, shortens attacker dwell time, and improves the organization's ability to detect, analyze, and respond with confidence. Over time, these fundamentals turn a reactive security posture into a proactive one that can keep up with evolving threats.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.